Abandoned under an overpass by her own daughter at 100 years old, old Clara thought her life was over, destined to end in loneliness and despair. But in a cruel twist of fate, weeks later, she heard news that this same daughter was dying and needed a bone marrow transplant, and she was the only compatible match. Will a mother's love overcome the pain of the cruelest betrayal? Will she choose to save the one who mercilessly abandoned her? We are so happy to welcome you to our channel. Do you believe in unconditional forgiveness? Leave a heart icon. Comments if you do. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we don't miss each other in the stories to come. Now, let's begin this tear-jerking and moving journey together. The sky that afternoon was stained an opaque gray that seemed to foretell misfortune, and inside Kimberly's house, the atmosphere was thick, with a tension you could cut with a knife. Kimberly paced back and forth in the dining room, arms crossed, with that severe expression she adopted whenever she spoke about her mother. She said in a low but firm voice that she couldn't go on like this, that caring for a 100-year-old woman was an unbearable burden, that the house smelled of medicine, old prayers, and memories that didn't interest her. Wayne watched her from the armchair with a cold, calculating calm, nodding slowly like someone confirming what he had already decided long ago. He told her she was right, that they had done too much, that the old woman no longer contributed anything, that the best thing was to leave her somewhere where others would take charge, or in the worst-case scenario, where fate would decide for her. Kimberly was silent for a few seconds, but then repeated that she was fed up, that her friends gossiped behind her back, that she couldn't have visitors with her mother always sitting in a corner, staring blankly, and that her life was slipping away between adult diapers and hot soups for a woman who wasn't even grateful anymore. In the next room, the old woman, Clara, heard fragments of that conversation. She couldn't believe those words were coming from her own daughter's lips, the little girl she had held in her arms through so many feverish nights, the young woman she had watched marry a man she never fully trusted with her heart. At 100 years old, her body trembled with weakness, but her mind still held enough clarity to understand they were talking about her as if she were a piece of old, obstructive furniture. She put a hand to her chest, closed her eyes, and murmured a prayer, asking the Holy Mother to give her strength to endure what was to come. Wayne jumped up and said that this very afternoon would be the end of the burden. Kimberly hesitated for a moment, not because the decision pained her, but because of what people would say, because of the shame if someone saw her abandoning her mother. But Wayne reassured her, saying that nobody pays attention to one more old woman on the street, that there would be no scandal. So Kimberly took a deep breath, adjusted the expensive watch she flaunted, and walked to the room where the old woman was resting. With a dry voice, she told her to get ready, that they were going out for a drive. The old woman asked where they were going, but Kimberly just replied that she would see, and not to ask so many questions. The old woman, with her slow steps, tried to stand while leaning her hand on the wall. She was wearing a worn-out cotton dress and a dark shawl covering her shoulders. Her feet could barely support her, but with effort, she took an old suitcase she kept under the bed, in which she had long ago packed a couple of blankets and a few items of clothing she'd saved from a time when she still dreamed of not being a burden. Kimberly looked at her impatiently, snatched the suitcase from her, and carried it to the car. Wayne watched from the passenger seat, sighing. He opened the back door for the old woman and tossed her small, worn suitcase onto the seat beside her. "Make sure she has it," Kimberly snapped from the driver's seat. "I don't want it left in the trunk." She wanted the removal to be quick, with no forgotten items. With a brusque gesture, Wayne indicated for Clara to get in. She obeyed in silence, settling into the seat with difficulty as tears began to roll down her cheeks, unstoppable. The journey was a long silence, broken only by the car's engine and the drumming of the rain on the windshield. The old woman, her gaze lowered, thought about all the moments she had shared with her daughter. The birthdays, the childhood hugs, the prayers they recited together before bed. She couldn't understand at what point love had turned to indifference, at what point blood had stopped meaning loyalty. Kimberly, at the wheel, stared hard at the road with a harsh expression, sighing now and then as if lifting a weight from her shoulders. Wayne, in the passenger seat, lit a cigarette and said with a satisfied tone that from now on they would live peacefully, without responsibilities tying them down, that it was for the best for everyone. The old woman heard those words and closed her eyes, feeling each sentence like a knife stabbing her heart. After several minutes, the car stopped on the outskirts of Baltimore, in a desolate place where the only sound was the distant echo of cars passing on the highway overpass. It was a gray, damp underpass with faded graffiti and a smell of mildew that permeated the air. Wayne got out of the car, opened the back door, and told the old woman to get out. She asked with a trembling voice what she was doing there, but he simply replied that she was staying in this place. Kimberly didn't say a word. She just avoided looking at her while pretending to fix her jacket. The old woman, finally understanding the cruel truth, took her suitcase, got out with unsteady steps, and stood under the shadow of the overpass. The car started again with a dry roar of the engine, and as it pulled away, the old woman raised a trembling hand, as if trying to stop them. But the vehicle disappeared into the rain and the highway noise. This is the ultimate betrayal. At 100 years old, Clara is left with nothing but a small suitcase and the echo of the car that carried her only child. It truly feels like this is the end of her story. But sometimes, rock bottom is the foundation for an unbelievable miracle. She was left alone, her heart torn apart, hugging her suitcase as if it were the only thing she had left in the world. She looked around. The damp walls of the underpass, the cardboard scraps scattered on the ground, the cold wind that chilled her to the bone. There was no one, only her and the heavy silence of loneliness. She sank to the ground, leaning her back against a concrete column. Her hands were shaking, and her eyes filled with tears. In that moment, she looked up at the sky, invisible behind the clouds, and murmured with a broken voice, "Holy Mother, don't let me lose my faith, even if I have nothing left." She repeated those words over and over, like a mantra keeping her alive in the midst of despair. Her body shivered from the cold, but inside her chest, a flame of hope still burned, refusing to be extinguished. Night fell upon her with an unbearable weight. The air grew colder, and every noise from the highway reminded her how far she was from everything she had ever called home. Even so, the old woman decided she wouldn't cry anymore, that she would save her tears for prayer, to ask for strength. As she settled under a threadbare blanket that barely covered her bones, she thought that perhaps God had a purpose in this suffering, even if she couldn't understand it yet. And in the midst of that darkness, alone under the overpass, began the story that would forever change not only her life, but the lives of all who crossed her path. The old woman remained alone under the overpass, with the echo of the cars passing above as the only reminder that the world kept moving while she had been thrown into oblivion. During the first few days, she learned that life on the streets is unforgiving and that she had to cling to every crumb that came her way, whether from someone's compassion or pure chance. The ground was hard and cold. The dampness crept up the concrete walls, accompanied by a smell of wet earth mixed with gasoline and human waste. But in that space that seemed to belong to no one, she began to build her small refuge with collected cardboard and a couple of frayed blankets she had managed to bring in her suitcase. She learned to accept charity with the humility of someone who knows that every piece of stale bread is a chance to survive one more night. Sometimes she would extend her trembling hand to passers-by and say with a soft voice, "God bless you." And although many walked past without even looking at her, some would drop in coins or a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in a napkin. And with that, she managed to stave off hunger for a few more hours. Her hunched figure became a familiar sight to those who walked near the overpass, but most didn't see her, as if she had become part of the gray landscape. There were women who looked at her with disdain, quickening their pace and clutching their purses tighter. There were men who muttered under their breath that she was a useless burden on society. But there were also kind souls who stopped for a moment. A young man who worked at a local bakery started leaving her the leftover bread from the day every night, and she always told him she would pray for his mother, because only a good son could have such gestures. A street vendor selling fruit would give her bruised apples she couldn't sell, and the old woman received them with gratitude as if they were delicacies. But what marked her most were the eyes of the children who looked at her with curiosity, whispering to their parents, asking why that grandma was sleeping on the street. And then the adults, uncomfortable, would pull them away, as if poverty were a contagious disease. Time on the street seemed to be measured not in days or hours, but in endurance. the old woman learned to recognize the sound of approaching storms before the rain began to fall. And when that happened, she would take refuge under the cardboard she had stacked against the wall, even though she knew she would end up soaked anyway. One night in particular, the downpour was so intense that water ran like a river under the overpass, and her clothes stuck to her skin as she huddled, trying to protect herself. Even so, her lips never stopped moving in prayer. She would say, "Holy Mother, don't let me falter. You who know a mother's pain, stay with me in this darkness." Her voice trembled, but every word was a reminder that her faith remained intact, even when the cold seemed to split her bones. Loneliness was a constant shadow. In the silence of the early morning, when the cars became less frequent and the city's echo faded, the old woman felt as if the entire world had forgotten her. There were moments when she wanted to give up, to stop fighting, and allow the exhaustion to drag her into a sleep from which she wouldn't wake. But then, she would remember the days she held her daughter in her arms, the sacrifices she had made to raise her, and she understood that she couldn't let the abandonment by her family extinguish the light that still burned in her heart. She would tell herself, "As long as I have the strength to pray, I still have the strength to live." Some days, when the sun managed to filter through the clouds, she would sit in silence looking at the sky, thinking how different life was when she still had a home. She remembered the smell of coffee in the mornings, the sound of the church bells, the warmth of a clean bed. Now, all of that was a distant memory, but she kept it alive in her mind like a treasure no one could take from her. And in that contrast between what was and what is, she found reasons to resist. She'd say, "If God allowed me to reach 100, it can't be to let me die here without purpose. There must be a reason hidden in this suffering." Weeks blurred into a month, and the seasons began to turn, each change bringing a new trial. The damp cold of autumn nights felt sharper, a prelude to the winter she dreaded. She watched the leaves fall from a nearby tree, comparing them to her own life, once vibrant, now detached and waiting to be swept away. Yet, she resisted. She learned to mark time not by a calendar, but by the faces of the kind souls who offered food, and by the rosary beads she counted thrice daily. This slow, grinding passage of time was its own form of cruelty, but it was also a crucible. It burned away her lingering indignation, leaving only a core of pure, stubborn faith. She was no longer just surviving. She was enduring. The days passed, and with them, the lessons of the street. She understood she couldn't trust everyone, because there were those who approached only to mock her. A pair of teenagers passed by one afternoon, throwing small rocks at her while laughing, saying she smelled like misery. She only responded by lowering her head and praying for them, because she preferred that hate not touch her soul. Another day, a drunk man got too close and tried to snatch her blanket, but a passerby stopped him, and the old woman gave thanks in silence, convinced it was the Holy Mother who had sent that help at just the right moment. Every experience, good or bad, molded her with a resilience she never imagined she had. She learned to share the little she received with other homeless people who occasionally approached the overpass. One night, she met another hungry old woman and broke the stale bread she was saving in half, telling her, "Even though it's little, God will multiply this kindness in both our hearts." The other woman cried and thanked her, saying no one had given her anything in days. And in that instant, the old woman felt she still had a purpose in life, to be a comfort in the midst of abandonment. The nights were always the hardest. The silence became a mirror of her loneliness, and memories of her daughter haunted her like ghosts. She wondered how someone who once told her "I love you" could have left her thrown aside like trash. But instead of letting resentment grow, she forced herself to think that perhaps her daughter was blinded by ambition, that one day she would understand the weight of her mistake. She'd say, "I don't hate her. I forgive her, starting now. Because if I don't forgive her, I'll die faster from that than from the cold." And so, between prayers, crumbs of bread, and rainy nights, the old woman found a way to keep going one more day. Every dawn was a miracle, every piece of food a gift, every compassionate glance a reminder that not everyone had forgotten the value of kindness. And although loneliness consumed her like a slow fire, her faith stood tall, erect like a lighthouse in the darkness, sustaining her and preparing her for what was to come. In the depths of her heart, She felt that this life under the overpass was not the end, but simply a prelude to something she could not yet understand. The early morning fell with a strange silence under the overpass, a silence that wasn't complete because the distant rumor of cars on the highway and the constant dripping of moisture in the concrete cracks always filtered through. But that night, there was something different. A muffled thudding that broke the monotony. The old woman, huddled under her cardboard and wrapped in her damp blanket, woke with the feeling that someone was calling her without words. She sat up slowly, her bones creaking like dry branches, and strained her ears, her lips moving in prayer, asking the Holy Mother for discernment. It was then she heard it more clearly. A sound of muffled blows, as if something or someone was moving, trapped, and then a stifled groan that made her skin crawl. Her first impulse was to be scared and stay still. On the street, any noise could mean danger. But something inside her, perhaps the inner voice she always attributed to faith, pushed her to get up. She advanced with short steps toward the sound. The area was dark, barely lit by a distant, yellowish lamp that struggled to pierce the damp fog. The old woman then made out the silhouette of a car parked a few yards away, a large, dark sedan that seemed out of place under the overpass. Her heart pounded. She thought maybe some dangerous men had left it there, but the insistent sounds guided her. She approached slowly, leaning on the concrete wall, her breath short. She noticed the back of the car was vibrating slightly, as if something inside was moving. The thudding repeated, and a muffled cry reached her, confirming someone was inside. The old woman, Clara, murmured to herself, "My God, give me strength to face whatever I find here," and her feet, though trembling, kept moving forward. When she was close enough, she placed her fragile hands on the cold metal of the trunk and tried to listen better. She then heard a desperate gasp and an attempted scream, muffled by some kind of cloth. The old woman recoiled for a moment, paralyzed by the certainty that a person was trapped inside. She thought it could be an innocent soul, or perhaps someone criminals had wanted to hide, but the only thing echoing in her mind was that she had to help. She said quietly, "I cannot let a child of God die in here," and began to search for something to open the lock. She looked around and, among the debris under the overpass, found a rusted piece of rebar, probably part of an old structure left behind by time. Her hands trembled holding it, but she felt it was no coincidence she had found it right there, right then. With effort, she knelt in front of the trunk and began to force the rebar into the lock mechanism. The task was arduous. Her arms had little strength, and the metal was corroded, but the need to help gave her an unexpected vigor. As she worked, she heard the blows from inside again, stronger this time, as if the trapped person knew someone was trying to free them. The old woman, with cold sweat on her forehead and tears welling in her eyes, said in a choked voice, "It is not my hands. It is the strength of God and our Holy Mother. Guide this iron to open this lock." Every attempt made her muscles ache. Every movement reminded her of her body's limitations, but the desire to save that stranger was stronger than her pain. Finally, after several attempts where it seemed the rebar would break before the lock, a sharp click was heard, and the trunk popped open. The old woman fell back, surprised, and the car's interior revealed a scene that wrenched her heart. There, folded painfully, was an older man, gray-haired and his face slick with sweat, his hands tied and his mouth covered by a cloth gag. In the very place she was left to die, Clara has just become a savior. This frail woman, who seemingly has no strength left, has just been given a profound purpose. This single act of courage, rescuing Arthur and his dog, is the moment her fate begins to turn. His eyes, wide with terror, met the old woman's. In that instant, she knew she had arrived in time. The man tried to make muffled sounds, and Clara hurried to remove the gag with trembling fingers. When he could finally speak, he said between sobs, "Thank you. Thank you for not letting me die here. I thought no one would hear me." The old woman, Clara, with tears streaming down her cheeks, replied, "It was not my strength that opened this lock. It was God and the Holy Mother who sent me here. Finding you cannot be an accident." As she clumsily untied him, the man watched her with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, wondering how this frail woman had achieved what he thought impossible. Once free, he sat up with difficulty, and the old woman saw that next to him was a noble-looking dog that had also been trapped. an animal that immediately leaped out with a weak bark, as if celebrating its freedom. The man petted the dog tenderly and said, "This is Buddy, my only faithful companion, and now he owes his life to you too." The scene under the overpass took on an almost sacred air. The damp dawn, the bone-chilling cold, the metallic smell of the old car. It all became secondary to the certainty that here, in the midst of abandonment and despair, an act of redemption had occurred. The old woman felt the tears washing her face and murmured again, "Thank you, Blessed Mother, for showing me I can still serve, I can still save, I can still be an instrument of your love." The man took her hands firmly and said, "I don't know who you are or how you got here, but know that I will never forget this moment. You gave me back my life when I expected nothing." She looked him in the eyes and replied, "I expected nothing, either. My own blood abandoned me, my body no longer obeys, and I thought my life had ended under this overpass. But today, I understand that God still had a hidden purpose for me." And as she spoke those words, she felt deep within her being that everything she had lived through, all the suffering and loneliness, had led her to this precise instant, to this unexpected encounter that would mark the beginning of a new chapter she had never imagined. In the distance, the first rays of dawn began to timidly light the city, and under the overpass, two souls met: an old woman stripped of everything and a man reduced to helplessness, now united by an act of faith and courage. Neither of them knew it yet, but that dawn would be the beginning of a story of hope, second chances, and love that would transcend the despair of misery. The dawn light began to draw timid contours on the horizon, while the man who had just emerged from the trunk tried to catch his breath. His name was Arthur, and his face reflected not only the physical exhaustion of hours of confinement, but also the weight of a fear that had made him believe he would never see daylight again. He bent over slightly, resting his hands on his knees, his breathing ragged, while the dog, Buddy, circled him, as if verifying he was finally safe. The old woman, Clara, watched him in silence, her eyes still moist from the effort and emotion, thinking that in all her years she had never imagined living such a strange and miraculous scene. Arthur raised his eyes to her, and with a voice broken by exhaustion, told her he had been captured by men demanding money. They had beaten him and left him locked in that car while they figured out how to get their ransom. But in the middle of the night, they heard a noise on the overpass and fled in terror, thinking the police were approaching, leaving him abandoned in the dark. The old woman listened intently, feeling a mixture of horror and compassion, imagining the torment of being trapped in such a small space. With the serenity of one who has learned to see suffering through faith, she replied, "It wasn't chance that allowed you to survive, but the hand of the Holy Mother that pulled the strings so I would be here with that piece of rebar at the precise moment your life was in greatest danger." Arthur looked down, moved. Just then, the dog, a noble-eyed mixed breed, approached the old woman, lay down at her feet, and looked up at her, as if recognizing her as a protector sent from above. Surprised, she extended a trembling hand and stroked the animal's back. He responded with a soft bark, a sound that in that instant sounded more like gratitude than anything else. Arthur, seeing the scene, couldn't hold back his tears. He said he would never forget that a woman whom life had treated so harshly was the one who saved him. He added that he didn't know how to thank her, that what she had done for him was more valuable than all the money he had ever earned working the land. The old woman looked at him sweetly and replied that he had nothing to thank her for. She had no strength of her own. It was God's hands guiding her and the intercession of the Holy Mother, who never abandons those who suffer. At that moment, Arthur approached, took the woman's fragile hands, and brought them to his face with reverent respect, repeating between sobs that he would see her again, that he wouldn't leave her alone under that overpass, that his life belonged to her now because she had returned it to him when he had already given it up for lost. The old woman felt that gesture pierce the walls of loneliness she had carried for weeks. Deep in her heart, something ignited like a spark, the certainty that perhaps there was still a purpose for her existence. Tears streamed down both Arthur's and Clara's cheeks, and the dog at their feet seemed to keep a reverent silence, as if he, too, understood he was witnessing an invisible pact between two broken souls who had met in misfortune to support each other. The new day's light slowly filtered through the crevices of the overpass, tinting the damp concrete gold. In that dawn, both understood that nothing would ever be the same. Arthur, his voice still choked, recounted that they had taken him by force from his farm. They had beaten him, and he had thought of his late wife and the children he never had, believing he would die without seeing his land or his home again. As he spoke, the old woman listened attentively, nodding slowly. She told him that the loneliness of the street also kills, but when one remembers they are not truly alone, because God is always with them, then one finds the courage to resist. He replied that he had lost all hope inside that trunk, that he had prayed, but with fear, without enough faith. And now, seeing her before him, he understood that his prayers had been answered, though in a way he never could have imagined. She smiled with the tenderness born of shared suffering, and told him her life had also lost, meaning the day her own daughter abandoned her, that she thought she was destined to die there, invisible and forgotten. But finding him, she understood it wasn't her time, that God had written an unexpected chapter for them both. Arthur squeezed the old woman's hands tighter and affirmed that he would not abandon her, that he would come back for her, that he owed her everything he was, and that from this day on, his life would have to include this woman whom the world had despised, but whom he recognized as a living miracle. The scene was etched in both their memories as a revelation. The dog, Buddy, stirred, got up, and sniffed the air, as if announcing it was time to leave. Arthur knew he had to return to his home to recover and heal his physical and moral wounds. But he also knew his path was now forever linked to this old woman. Before leaving, he bowed once more and told her, "I will be back, I promise you. I will not leave you in this place, because now I know God put you in my path to remind me there is still goodness in this world." A promise is a powerful thing, but Clara has already been betrayed by the one person who should have kept her safe. It's hard to know if she can trust the words of a stranger. We can only hold our breath and hope that Arthur's promise is stronger than her daughter's betrayal. The old woman looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion, and simply nodded. "Go with God," she whispered. "You must always remember his mercy." Arthur nodded respectfully. As he walked away with Buddy following close behind, he turned his head several times to look back at the old woman, as if fearing she might vanish into the air. She watched him until his figure was lost in the distance. And then, alone again under the overpass, she knelt on the damp ground and offered a prayer of gratitude, not for surviving another night, but because she finally understood her pain was not in vain. In the midst of misery, she had been chosen to save another human being, and that act, more than any other, had given her life back too. The days following that encounter were marked by a mixture of uncertainty and hope in the old woman's heart. After freeing Arthur that dawn, she returned to her routine of surviving in the damp shadows of the overpass, collecting the pieces of stale bread people left, wrapping herself in the old blankets that barely gave her warmth, and praying in silence not to lose faith. However, something had changed in her. A different sensation pulsed inside her like a quiet fire, reminding her that life could still surprise her. She thought often of that noble-eyed man, of his words of gratitude, of his promise to return. She told herself they were perhaps just words spoken in the heat of the moment, that it was common for people to make promises and not keep them. But there was something in the firmness of his voice that made her believe he would indeed come back. On the third day after the encounter, as the old woman was settling under her cardboard, shivering from the early morning wind, she heard firm footsteps approaching, accompanied by a familiar bark. She sat up slowly, her heart beating faster, and in the gloom, she recognized the figure of Arthur walking with a package in his hands and Buddy wagging his tail with joy. Arthur called her name softly and said, "I promised I would return, and here I am. I haven't been able to sleep peacefully thinking of you. I couldn't imagine you suffering from cold and hunger after what you did for me." The old woman felt her eyes fill with tears, seeing that someone remembered her, that someone had kept their word. She extended her trembling hands toward him, as if receiving a gift from heaven. Arthur knelt beside her and opened the package. Inside was a carefully wrapped container that still held the warmth of a hot stew, fresh bread, and a bottle of clean water. The old woman breathed in deeply. The aroma of the food brought back memories of times when she still had a home. She couldn't hold back tears as she tasted the first spoonful. She told him she hadn't tasted anything hot in weeks, that God had sent him to give her strength, that he was like an angel disguised as a farmer. Arthur smiled humbly and replied, "You were my angel first. If I am alive, it is because of you. The least I can do is take care of you now." As she ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the company, the old woman began to open her heart. With a trembling voice, she told him she hadn't always lived on the street, that she once had a home. Her daughter, Kimberly, had cared for her for a time, but then, influenced by the selfishness and control of her husband, Wayne, abandoned her there as if she were a burden. She said that at first she cried a lot, that she thought she would die of sadness more than hunger, that she hoped her daughter would reconsider and come back for her. But the days turned into weeks, and she understood that no one was coming. She confessed she no longer expected anything from life, that she received each dawn only as another trial, and that she had begun to resign herself to dying in silence under that overpass. Arthur listened without interrupting, his face serious, his eyes moist. When she finished, he took a breath and told her that no one deserves to be abandoned, that a mother's value isn't measured by her utility, but by the love she gave. He said he couldn't understand how a child could cast aside the one who gave them life. He added that from that day on, she would not be alone, that he would return frequently, that as long as he had strength, he would always visit her, and that furthermore, he would never come alone, because Buddy had already decided to adopt her as part of his family. The dog, as if understanding, lay down at the old woman's feet and rested his head on her knees, making her smile for the first time in weeks. Arthur's visits became an expected and sacred routine. Every 2 or 3 days, he would appear with a basket of food, with clean clothes he said he'd gathered from his house, with a thicker blanket to protect her from the cold, and with stories of his life in the country that the old woman listened to, fascinated. He talked about the horses, planting corn, the sunny days on the farm, and the quiet nights under the starry sky. She would listen in silence, sometimes closing her eyes to imagine those landscapes she hadn't seen in so long, feeling his words were like open windows to a different life she could still dream of. With each meeting, the bond between them grew stronger. The old woman, who at first barely lifted her gaze, began to wait eagerly for the moment Arthur and Buddy would appear. She found she no longer counted the days just to survive, but for the pleasure of hearing his voice again and feeling that someone saw her, that she wasn't invisible, that she still had value. At night, when the cold enveloped her, she found herself thinking that perhaps she wasn't completely alone, that the world still held a corner for her. And then her prayer changed. She no longer asked the Holy Mother just for strength to endure, but for gratitude for the miracle of placing this man in her path. Arthur, for his part, began to notice something in the old woman that moved him deeply. He thought to himself that he had seen many injustices in his life, but few as cruel as the abandonment of a mother. And yet, she spoke of her daughter without resentment, always with a tone of resigned sadness, but never hatred. One afternoon, while leaving her clean clothes, he asked her if she hated Kimberly for what she had done. The old woman replied, "Hate is a poison that kills faster than poverty. I don't hate my daughter, because I still love her, even though it hurts." Arthur fell silent, impressed by that capacity for forgiveness, and understood that this woman possessed a spiritual greatness that surpassed his own. As the weeks passed, what began as an act of gratitude transformed into a sincere friendship. Arthur didn't just bring her food. He stayed to talk for long stretches, sometimes late into the night. In those moments, the old woman felt accompanied, almost as if she had regained part of the family she had lost. Buddy became the guardian of her nights, curling up to sleep beside her when the cold intensified, as if he understood his presence was also a comfort. Life under the overpass remained hard, but it was no longer the same. Every smile from Arthur, every gesture of kindness, every moment of the faithful dog's company, accumulated in the old woman's heart like pieces of a new beginning. What was once absolute despair slowly transformed into the certainty that even in the darkest corners of life, a light can be kindled. And so, between simple chats, shared prayers, and hot meals, the old woman began to feel she was no longer alone, that she was seen again, that she could still be loved. And that certainty was a balm that kept her alive, day after day. The morning Arthur arrived at the overpass with a different kind of determination in his eyes. The old woman was already waiting, sitting on her old blanket, accompanied by Buddy, who had spent the night beside her like a faithful sentinel. Those days of meetings had transformed her routine of misery into an existence of hopeful waiting. But that morning, the air carried a different premonition, as if something big was about to happen. Arthur approached with a steady step, and after greeting her with the respect he always showed, he sat down in front of her. He remained silent for a long time, until the old woman asked with a soft voice why he seemed so pensive. It was then he told her the time had come for her to leave that overpass. He said he could no longer bear to see her shivering in the night or eating scraps, that on his farm he had a small, unoccupied cottage, simple but dignified, where she could live peacefully and without fear, surrounded by fertile earth, animals, and the open sky that brings peace to the heart. The old woman looked at him, surprised. Her first reaction was doubt. She was afraid of being a burden again. She told him she didn't want to be a weight on anyone, that she had lived long enough to understand that people grow tired of the elderly and leave them behind, that she preferred to get used to her loneliness rather than experience that pain again. Arthur then leaned toward her, took her hands and replied, "Don't talk like that. What you did for me is priceless. I don't see you as a burden, but as a blessing. It is only right that you should now be able to rest under a roof. There is no other person who deserves a corner of my farm more than the woman who, with a rusted piece of rebar and the strength of her faith, gave me back my life." Arthur's words sank deep into the old woman's soul, and her eyes began to moisten until she could no longer hold back the tears. For years, she had felt that no one needed her, that her life had been reduced to a painful memory for her daughter and an inconvenience for the world. But now this man was looking at her as if she were essential. With a broken voice, she confessed she never thought she would hear something like that the abandonment had convinced her she was worthless, that she didn't even expect to die under a roof, but on the damp ground of the overpass. But his words restored her certainty that her existence still had dignity. Arthur listened patiently and insisted again that she come with him. In the cottage, she could tend a garden, care for animals, and feel the joy of waking up with a purpose again. He said he wasn't looking for pity, but for companionship. Since his wife died, the farm had become too quiet. Finally, the old woman accepted, but not before looking at the sky and murmuring, "Thank you, Holy Mother, for hearing my prayers of so many nights." When Arthur helped her to her feet and picked up her worn-out suitcase, she cried as she hadn't in a long time, tears of gratitude that flowed not just for the chance to have a home, but because someone had truly seen her, someone had chosen her when all she expected was to be forgotten. The journey to the farm was marked by a different kind of silence than the one when she was taken to the overpass. This was a silence full of expectation, where the landscape changed as the city fell behind and green fields began to open up under the Sunday. The old woman looked out the window with wide, almost childlike eyes. Every tree, every wooden fence, every stretch of cultivated land was like a breath of fresh air for her tired heart. When they arrived at the farm, Arthur led her to a small whitewashed cottage with a shingled roof, which stood near the vegetable garden. It wasn't large or luxurious, but it was clean, with a simple bed covered by a floral quilt, a wooden table polished by the years, and a window from which one could see the countryside stretching to the horizon. Upon entering, the old woman put her hands to her face and said, "I never thought I would see a home again. This is more than I ever asked for in my prayers." After so much suffering, Clara finally has a moment of peace and dignity. This small cottage is more than just a roof. It's proof that she is not invisible. It truly feels like her journey has found its happy ending, but fate has one more shocking test in store for her. Arthur replied that from now on, it was her home, that she could feel it as her own, and he promised that as long as he lived, she would never know abandonment again. Buddy, as if understanding, ran into the room and lay down by the bed, as if indicating that this place was now protected territory. The days that followed were a learning process filled with small victories. The old woman, Clara, would wake up early, accompanied by Arthur, and together they would walk through the vegetable garden where tomatoes, bell peppers, and zucchini grew. At first, her hands trembled, and it was hard to hold the tools. But little by little she began to remember the chores of her youth when she used to farm with her husband before she was widowed. She found joy in watering the plants, in pulling weeds, in carefully picking the first fruits. She would say with a shy smile, I never imagined I would smell fresh earth at dawn again. Every seed that sprouts is a symbol of resurrection for me." Arthur would watch her work and tell her she seemed to be growing younger among the plants, that her eyes shone with a new strength. The old woman would reply that it was because in every sprout she saw a small miracle granted by God. She also learned to feed the animals, to bring corn to the chickens that ran around her, to give water to the horses, to pet the farm dogs, who gradually recognized her as part of the family. In those moments, she felt that life was still giving her instants of peace. When she grew tired, she would sit on a wooden bench under the shade of a tree and breathe deeply, grateful to be able to gaze at the open sky and hear the song of birds instead of the cold roar of cars on the overpass. But the most moving moment was the first night she slept in that clean bed. Lying under a warm quilt, with the scent of wood filling the air and the silence of the countryside enveloping her, she allowed herself to cry again. But this time, they weren't tears of sadness, but of relief. She murmured in the darkness, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me this peace. I thought I would die on the street, invisible and forgotten, and now I rest as if I have become a daughter and a mother at the same time." She closed her eyes, and sleep enveloped her with a gentleness she hadn't known in years. That night, she didn't dream of abandonment or hunger, but of green fields and smiling faces. And when she woke, with the first rays of sun illuminating her window, she knew that for the first time in a long time, she had a home, and that miracle had arrived in the most unexpected way. The mornings on the farm were filled with a new air after the old woman's arrival. Although her body still carried the weight of her years, her steps became firmer and her eyes more alive, as if the earth itself had adopted her and was giving back the strength that abandonment and misery had stolen. At dawn, as the sun peeked over the hills and the mist slowly dissipated, she would come out of the cottage with a watering can in her hands and walk toward the garden. Her lips would begin to hum old hymns she had learned in her youth, simple, repetitive melodies that spoke of planting, of rain, and of hope. Although her voice was weak and trembling, it resonated with a pure timbre that filled the air with an unexpected sweetness. Arthur would often stop to listen from a distance, thinking to himself that it was as if her voice made the plants flourish faster, because there was no other explanation for the vitality with which the garden thrived. One morning, as she was watering the tomatoes and humming an old folk song, he approached and told her, "I never thought the fields could sound like this. Since my wife passed, all I heard were birds and wind. But now the air is filled with a human song that brings life back to my home." The old woman smiled humbly and replied, "Every drop of water I give the earth is like a prayer. Singing is my way of thanking God for the gift of a new day." Buddy became her inseparable shadow. Wherever she went, the dog followed with the devotion of one who knows he has found a heart that accepts him. When the old woman took corn to the chickens, he would run around her, barking softly, as if supervising the chore. When she bent down to pull weeds from the furrows, he would lie beside her and rest his head on her knees, waiting for a pet. One afternoon, as she swept the patio with a makeshift broom, Buddy appeared with a stick in his mouth and dropped it at her feet. The old woman laughed as she hadn't in years, bending down to throw it and watch the dog chase it joyfully. In the midst of these small routines, the loneliness that had been her cruelest enemy began to dissipate, replaced by the sincere companionship of an animal that asked for nothing more than to be near. She would tell him, "You are like a son who never tires of waiting for me. Your loyalty teaches me that there is still faithfulness in the world." And Buddy, as if understanding every word, would respond with a soft bark and an enthusiastic wag of his tail. The nights on the farm also filled with conversations that wove an ever deeper bond between the old woman and Arthur. Sitting on the cottage porch under a sky studded with stars, she began to tell him episodes from her childhood, when she was just a girl running barefoot on dirt roads, when she learned her first prayers from her mother, and when her father taught her to recognize the signs of the harvest. She spoke nostalgically of times when life was hard, but there was community, when neighbors helped each other, and when no one left an old person adrift, because everyone understood that old age was a mirror of their own future. She said that faith had sustained her at every stage in poverty, in sickness, in widowhood, and even in the betrayal of abandonment, because when everything else crumbles, faith is the only foundation that doesn't break. Arthur listened to her attentively, interrupting only to ask questions or to say that these stories were treasures that shouldn't be lost. He himself was surprised by the calm her voice gave him, by the feeling of rediscovering a forgotten meaning in the words of a woman who had suffered so much and yet still spoke with love. There was one particular night when Arthur, after a long silence, confessed that since his wife's death, he hadn't felt as much peace as he felt now, sharing these evenings with her. He said that when his wife died, the farm filled with an unbearable silence, that the days became mechanical, and that even though the fields continued to produce, his soul had become barren, unable to find joy in anything. He added that he had come to think loneliness would be his only companion until the end. But since the old woman entered his life, even the smallest things, like watching Buddy run in circles or hearing a prayer before sleep, had become significant again. The old woman, Clara, her eyes shining, replied, "Peace is not something found in abundance or power, but in a shared heart. Perhaps the Holy Mother decided our paths should cross to heal both our wounds." Arthur looked down and admitted she was probably right, that he didn't believe in coincidences, that it was too strange that she specifically had saved him that dawn, and that her presence now was a reminder that life always keeps one last miracle for those who dare to believe. The days filled with a new rhythm, one where the old woman no longer counted the hours waiting to die, but counted them waiting for the next harvest, the next conversation, the next sunrise. Every seed she buried in the earth was a promise of the future. Every laugh she shared with Arthur and Buddy was a rescue of her own humanity. And in that rebirth, she understood that the abandonment she suffered under the overpass had not been the end of her story, but the dark tunnel necessary to reach this new light. As she walked through the garden furrows with the watering can in hand, singing songs of hope, she realized her life had not only been prolonged, but transformed into a testament of faith, love, and resilience, capable of touching the heart of anyone who heard it. And so, between songs, games with a faithful dog, confessions under the stars, and the confession of a man regaining his lost peace, the old woman rose from her ashes, embracing life with a gratitude that kept her standing, more alive than ever. The afternoon fell slowly over the farm, and the last rays of the sun painted the fields Clara had learned to love in golden tones. The air was warm, with a soft scent of damp earth remaining from the morning's rain. Clara was sitting in an old wooden rocking chair that Arthur had placed on her cottage porch, a piece of knitting in her hands that barely progressed because her fingers tired quickly, but which she kept as a way to feel useful. Buddy rested at her side, breathing deeply with the tranquility of one who trusts his world is in order. In the distance, the first chirps of crickets announced the arrival of night. In the gentle silence of the countryside, the sound of a local radio station, which Arthur had left on a table, began to resonate with local news. She wasn't paying much attention at first, accustomed to hearing those voices as background noise. But suddenly, a familiar name emerged from the speakers and froze the blood in her veins. Kimberly. The announcer's voice said that a woman in her early 60s named Kimberly was admitted to the city hospital, that her condition was serious, and that she urgently needed a bone marrow transplant. What a cruel twist. The very daughter who abandoned Clara to die is now dying herself, and the radio announcement has found its way to the one person who might be able to help. After everything Kimberly did, no one could blame Clara for turning away. The question is, what will she do? Clara froze, her heart pounding against her chest as if trying to escape. She felt the air grow dense, the world shrinking to that single instant, to that name she had sworn never to speak aloud again. Kimberly, her daughter. The same one who had driven her in a car and left her under an overpass as if she were useless cargo, was now fighting for her life. The old woman let the knitting fall to the floor and brought her hands to her face. Her fingers trembled, her lips tried to form words, but only a broken sigh escaped. Buddy lifted his head, sensing her agitation, and looked at her with attentive eyes, as if asking what was wrong. She leaned toward the radio, as if needing to be sure she had heard correctly, and the announcer repeated the details. The woman was in delicate condition, the family was asking for help, and doctors were urgently searching for a compatible donor. Clara closed her eyes, and a wave of memories washed over her. Kimberly's face as a child, her laugh when she learned to walk, the feverish nights she held her against her chest, her wedding day when she thought her daughter's happiness was assured. All those memories mixed with the image of the abandonment, with the cold stare Kimberly had given her as she drove away in the car with Wayne, with the pain of seeing herself dumped under that overpass. She felt her heart split in two. The wound was still open, but now life was showing her that this same daughter depended on her to keep breathing. For several minutes, she remained in absolute silence, motionless in the rocking chair, her gaze lost on the horizon. Inside, she was fighting a cruel battle. One part of her remembered the suffering, the humiliation, the cold, and the hunger she had endured because of that betrayal. The other part, the deepest and oldest part, the one born the day Kimberly came into the world, screamed that this was her daughter, that blood and love are not erased, even when abandonment stains them. Arthur, returning from the fields at that moment, found her with glassy eyes and a pale face. Worried, he asked her what was wrong. She took a moment to answer, and finally said in a low voice, "I just heard on the radio that Kimberly, my daughter, is in the hospital. She needs a bone marrow transplant. They say her life depends on it." Arthur fell silent, stunned by the weight of the news. He tried to form words of comfort, but the old woman raised a hand, as if asking him not to speak yet. She rose slowly from the rocking chair and walked inside the cottage. There, she knelt in front of the small table where she kept an image of the Holy Mother and, with her hands clasped and her voice breaking, she began to pray. She said, "Holy Mother, you know how much the abandonment hurt me. You know I cried for whole nights in the cold. But you also know I never stopped loving my daughter, because a mother's love doesn't die, even when ingratitude covers it in shadows. I ask you for light, I ask for clarity, because my heart is trembling. But if it is your will that I be the instrument to save her, then give me the strength to do it." Her tears fell onto the wood, and her lips repeated the word forgiveness over and over, as if seeking to purify her heart before making the most difficult decision of her life. When she finished praying, she stood up, a serene calm on her face. She went out to the porch, looked at Arthur, who was still waiting, not daring to interrupt, and told him, "I've made a decision. I'm going to offer myself as a donor. It doesn't matter what she did to me. It doesn't matter how much it hurt. She is still my daughter, and if God allows me to save her, I cannot refuse." Arthur looked at her with astonishment, deeply moved. He told her that her heart was bigger than any wound, that he had never known anyone with such a profound capacity for forgiveness. She replied, "It's not about greatness. It's simply that a mother never stops being a mother. It can hurt, it can bleed, but it doesn't disappear. The abandonment doesn't get the last word on my life, or on Kimberly's." The decision was made. That night, as the moon lit the fields and silence enveloped the farm, the old woman sat in her rocking chair again, her face no longer downcast, but firm with the conviction of someone who has understood her destiny. She knew her fragile 100-year-old body might not withstand the ordeal, that the procedure could leave her even weaker. But she also knew she had been sustained by faith in harder times, and that if God had kept her alive until now, it was for this purpose. She looked at Buddy, sleeping peacefully at her feet, and told him in a low voice, "Tomorrow, a new path begins. And even if it takes my life, it will be to give my daughter hers back." In her heart, there were no more doubts. The news from the hospital had not just been a painful announcement, it had been a calling. And although the memory of the overpass was still vivid, she now understood that place had not been her end, but the beginning of the miracle that would lead her to this moment of surrender. The silence of the night witnessed her final decision, a decision that would mark not only her destiny, but also that of the daughter who once abandoned her, and who now depended on her love to exist. The morning Clara decided to leave for the hospital, the country air was fresh, and the clear sky promised a serene day. But inside her, the storm was immense. She had spent the entire night awake, sitting in her rocking chair, her gaze lost on the candle burning next to the image of the Holy Mother, reviewing over and over the determination she had reached after hearing the news on the radio. She knew that if she told Arthur, he would try to stop her, perhaps not out of selfishness, but for fear of losing her, because he had grown to cherish her as part of his own family. But she felt this step was hers alone to take, that she had to do it in silence, as an act of love that sought neither recognition nor applause. When the first rays of sun began to light her cottage window, she rose slowly, covered herself with a shawl that Arthur had given her, and left with firm steps, leaving behind the safety of the farm, determined to fulfill what she considered her final purpose in life. The trip to the city was long and exhausting, but the old woman barely felt it, her mind absorbed in prayer. As the bus moved along the dusty roads and then entered the gray asphalt of the avenues, she repeated silently, "Blessed Mother, give me strength not to falter. If this is the sacrifice I must offer for my daughter, help me fulfill it without fear." She watched the passengers getting on and off, young people going to work, mothers with children in their arms, men carrying toolboxes, and thought that everyone carried their own cross, that life was made of invisible sacrifices that didn't always receive gratitude. And she repeated to herself that her suffering was no different, that the important thing wasn't to be recognized, but to be faithful to the love a mother cannot bury, even when others try to cover it with abandonment. When she arrived at the hospital, the bustle of people enveloped her in a strange vertigo. The large building, with its white walls and endless corridors, was full of people rushing, nurses in hurried uniforms, families with anxious faces, doctors who barely had time to stop. She advanced slowly, with the calm her age imposed, to the information desk. When the clerk looked at her and asked what she needed, she replied with a soft voice, "I've come to offer myself as a potential bone marrow donor for a patient named Kimberly." The man looked up, surprised, assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and respect, and told her where to go. The old woman thanked him and walked down the hallway with an unsteady but determined gait, clutching the rosary she carried in her pocket as if it were an amulet. The registration process was long, with forms and seemingly endless questions, but she answered patiently. When they asked if she was related to the patient, she limited herself to saying, "She is someone important in my life," and asked that her identity be kept confidential. The doctors and nurses looked at her with some astonishment. It wasn't common for a 100-year-old woman to offer herself for such a delicate procedure. Some even warned her that the risk to her health was great. She listened to them respectfully and told them she understood the risks, that her body had already lived enough, and that if she had to give her last days to prolong her daughter's, she would do so without hesitation. That firmness disarmed any objection, and in the end, they agreed to run the compatibility tests. The hours of waiting were eternal. The old woman sat in a cold hallway, surrounded by metallic noises and murmuring people, her heart constricted as she prayed over and over. She remembered Kimberly's face as a child, the way she would run to her asking for comfort, and she felt that life had given her the chance to embrace that lost child again, even if invisibly. When a doctor finally approached with the results, she looked at him with trembling eyes and heard him say that the compatibility was perfect, that she could be the donor. She closed her eyes and, in a sigh, murmured, "Thank you, Lord, for giving me the chance to save her." The doctor insisted on explaining the risks, telling her that her age was a very large obstacle, that the chances of complications were high. But she replied with serenity that her life was already in God's hands, that she didn't fear for herself, only for what would happen if she refused. The day of the procedure arrived with a solemn air. The old woman was taken to a white, cold, silent room, where the ceiling lights seemed too bright. As they prepared her, she held the rosary tightly in her hands and closed her eyes to entrust herself to the Holy Mother. She said in silence, "Mother, if this is my last act on earth, receive it as an offering, not a sacrifice. For I do not give it with pain, but with love." The doctors were surprised by her calm. Some commented in low voices that it was incredible to see such fortitude in such an elderly woman. One of them even leaned toward her and said, "You have more courage than many young people." She smiled weakly and replied, "It is not courage. It is a mother's love, and true love doesn't calculate the risks. It only gives." The procedure was performed with the precision that science allows. As Clara undergoes this incredibly risky procedure at 100 years old, Kimberly is in another room, completely unaware that her life is being saved by the mother she discarded. This silent, anonymous sacrifice is the most powerful act of forgiveness imaginable. But will Clara's fragile body survive it? Although the old woman's body felt every step, she remained serene, conscious that the important thing was not what she suffered, but what was achieved. Meanwhile, in another hospital room, Kimberly slept, unaware that her mother's life was silently flowing into hers, never imagining that the one she had abandoned under an overpass was now offering her the marrow that could save her. The anonymity of the donation remained intact. That was the old woman's wish. She wanted no recognition, nor did she want Kimberly to feel obligated to thank her. She only wanted to give her a chance to live. When it was all over, the old woman awoke weak, her body aching, and an immense fatigue washing over her. But in her heart, she felt a profound peace. She knew her health was fragile, that perhaps she wouldn't have much time left, but she also knew she had fulfilled what she considered her final mission. In her mind, a phrase echoed. "The abandonment took me to the overpass, but forgiveness has lifted me to heaven." She closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest, convinced that her silent sacrifice was not in vain, that in this act of love, she had sealed the meaning of her entire life. The old woman's return to the farm after the procedure was marked by a heavy silence. She had taken the long bus ride back, using the last of her strength to walk from the bus stop to the cottage. When Arthur came to check on her that evening, he found her collapsed on the bed, still in her shawl, his heart filling with anguish. He noticed immediately that she was not the same. Her steps were slower, her gaze more tired, and though she smiled with serenity, a pallor on her face revealed the price her body was paying. He asked her tenderly, "What did they do to you at that hospital? Why didn't you tell me anything?" And she replied with a soft voice, "I cannot speak of it yet. All you need to know is that I did what was right, that I fulfilled what the Blessed Mother put in my path." Arthur didn't insist, seeing her exhaustion, but inside, he understood that this woman had carried a secret as great as her faith. The following days were a slow farewell, disguised as routine. Clara could no longer work in the vegetable garden as before, nor feed the animals with the same energy. Her hands trembled more, and her body weakened to the point that she spent long hours in bed, covered by the floral quilt she had loved since her arrival at the cottage. Arthur visited her every morning and every evening, bringing her hot broth, holding her hand, and telling her stories about the farm to distract her. But the old woman responded with only a few soft words, always grateful, but growing dimmer each day. Buddy became her most faithful guardian. He never left her side, sleeping by the bed, lifting his head every time she coughed or sighed, as if he understood he had to protect her until the last moment. One night, while a fever made her delirious, Clara called Arthur with a weak gesture and told him not to worry, that what he was seeing wasn't suffering, but preparation. The sky was calling her, little by little, and he shouldn't cry when she departed, because her life had already achieved the purpose she hoped for. Aware that her time was running out, the old woman asked for paper and a pen. It was difficult to hold the pencil between her trembling fingers, but with patience and determination, she began to write a letter. Every word was the fruit of the unconditional love that had sustained her existence. Every line was an invisible bridge extended toward Kimberly, her daughter, the one who had abandoned her and who now needed to know the truth. She wrote, "My daughter, I know life led us down painful roads, and that your decisions made me feel the cold of abandonment, but I never stopped loving you." She told her she had offered her marrow in silence, without revealing her name, because she didn't want the weight of guilt to overshadow the chance at life Kimberly now had. She explained that forgiveness hadn't been an effort, but a natural consequence of her mother's heart, that the memories of pain had been erased by the certainty that no child deserves to die if their mother can save them. She concluded by saying she held no grudge, that she wanted Kimberly to live in peace, that her sacrifice should not be seen as a debt, but as a gift. The only thing she asked was that she not repeat with others the indifference she had shown her. As she finished the letter, her tears dampened the paper. She gave the sealed envelope to Arthur, asking him with a broken voice, "When I am gone, please deliver this to Kimberly with your own hands." The illness consumed her bit by bit, until the day came when she could barely open her eyes. Arthur sat by the bed, took her hand firmly, and told her she wasn't alone, that she would never be as long as he breathed, and that he thanked God for knowing her, because she had restored the faith and peace he had lost after his wife's death. She looked at him with tenderness, her eyes tired but bright, and replied that he had been her comfort in her final days, that without him and Buddy, she would not have found the strength to live this last stage in peace. Then she slowly turned her face toward the dog lying at her feet and murmured, "Thank you for watching over me like a son. Your faithfulness reminded me that I was not entirely forgotten." Buddy lifted his head, let out a soft whine, and rested his muzzle on the quilt again, as if he understood it was goodbye. The last night was serene. The sky was clear, and the moon softly illuminated the cottage. Clara breathed with difficulty, but her face held a supernatural calm. She murmured prayers, almost whispers, asking the Holy Mother to receive her in her arms and for her daughter to find peace. Arthur, with tears in his eyes, remained by her side, stroking her hand and repeating, "I will never forget you. Your name and your goodness will live in every corner of this farm." She barely nodded and said, "My body is fading, but my soul leaves lightly, because I fulfilled my duty as a mother." She closed her eyes and, in a long, deep breath, surrendered her life with the serenity of one who had already done everything she was meant to do. The cottage fell silent, broken only by Arthur's contained sobs and Buddy's soft, muffled bark, as if calling to his mistress, though he knew she would not open her eyes again. The peace that remained in the air was immense, a peace that was not absence, but fullness, as if the old woman's presence lingered in every corner of the place. Arthur leaned over her, kissed her forehead, and said, "Rest in peace, brave woman. Your memory will be eternal in this home." Outside, the country breeze blew gently, and the moon lit the roof of the cottage as if the entire sky had descended to accompany her passing. Clara had died peacefully, accompanied by the man who rescued her from loneliness and the dog who never abandoned her. In her absence, she left a legacy of forgiveness and unconditional love that transcended death itself. The day the doctors said the crisis had passed and that Kimberly's body was beginning to accept the new marrow, the light entering the hospital window felt different, less harsh, warmer, as if the morning had decided to take her hand and guide her back to life. She woke with the residual heaviness of illness and a mixture of shame and disorientation she couldn't place. She looked at the IV, counted the scars, mentally reviewed the lost hours, and thought that life, for some reason, was offering her a second chance she didn't yet deserve. And in that barely formed thought, the door opened with a quiet creak. A countryman appeared, tall and respectful. He took one step inside, removed his hat, and said in a low voice, "I've come to see you, if you'll allow it. My name is Arthur, and I'm bringing something that couldn't wait." Kimberly, surprised, sat up as much as her strength allowed and asked stiffly who he was and why he was there. He replied, "I only know you through a story that isn't mine, but one that passes through me. I promised a very dear woman that when the time came, I would place a letter in your hands, a letter that asked to be read calmly and, if possible, with a clean heart." He then took a well-folded envelope from his jacket, marked with shaky handwriting and careful ink. He held it for a few seconds, as if the destiny it carried was heavy for him too, and placed it on the table next to the glass of water. He added, "I won't bother you further. I'll wait outside in case you have questions. If you wish me to leave, just say so." Kimberly stared at the envelope, as if afraid to open a door she couldn't close. She noticed a faint scent of laundry soap and the outdoors. Her fingers, still swollen from the treatments, moved clumsily to tear the paper. When she pulled out the folded sheet, she felt her pulse quicken uncomfortably. She turned it over. She immediately recognized the handwriting firm, yet trembling a script she had once seen on kitchen notes and framed prayer cards. Before reading, she already knew who it belonged to. She knew that, against all logic, this piece of paper would force her to face herself. She took a deep breath, blinked to clear her vision, and began. Each line was a thread tying her to a past she thought was buried, a past that was now returning, not to accuse her, but to save her. She read, "My daughter, wherever you are, if these words reach you, it is because God granted me the grace to touch you again without touching you." She read, "I held no grudge, my daughter. I forgive you, and I want you to be happy." The repetition of that simple phrase disarmed her, but she didn't stop. She kept reading. "There were nights of cold and hunger and loneliness that made me think the world had forgotten me. But the thought never left me that you, above your mistakes, were my little girl, and that if one day life asked something of you that I could give, I would give it, without you even having to ask. Kimberly felt a burning stab in her stomach, the metallic taste of remorse on her tongue. She lowered the page for a second, as if needing air. She glanced at the door, and saw a shadow waiting. She knew that man was still there, with a dog waiting in silence. She returned to the letter with desperate urgency. She found that the letter spoke of a dawn under an overpass, of a car trunk opened with a piece of rebar, of a life saved, and of another life reborn on a farm among tomatoes and chickens and a dog named Buddy. She understood instantly that her mother had not only survived her abandonment, but had also found a place where her heart was calm. And still, when the radio said your name and the word urgent, she decided to travel without notice, to present herself at the hospital anonymously, to offer her marrow without asking for anything. And here was the certainty, written in clear ink, saying, "If you are reading this, it is because my strength wasn't enough to hug you again. But my joy is knowing that you will live." This is the moment the devastating truth hits Kimberly. The wave of guilt is overwhelming, realizing the mother she threw away gave her life not once, but twice. How does a person even begin to recover from a sacrifice this enormous and a betrayal so deep? And may that life be good not for me, but for you, and for all those you can care for. The blow of reality was brutal. Kimberly's mind tried to deny the obvious, but the handwriting, the tone, the cadence of the sentences, it was all her mother. The woman she had reduced in her most uncomfortable memories to a shameful responsibility, to a burden, to a presence that stained the mirror of her ambition. And now that woman appeared, luminous, immense, humbly filing down the cruelest edge of her own story so that she, the ungrateful daughter, would find it easier to forgive herself. She clutched the paper to her chest and murmured with a broken voice, "Mom, Mom, what have you done?" She felt her body go limp, a mixture of relief and bottomless guilt. She returned to the end of the text to reread that last line, where her mother said, "I held no grudge, my daughter. I forgive you, and I want you to be happy." That simple blessing was an unbearable mirror, an embrace that hurt precisely because she didn't deserve it. Then she began to cry with an ancient sorrow, a cry that sought neither witnesses nor comfort, a cry that came from the little girl who had loved and the woman who had betrayed. She covered her face with her hands and let the pain empty her. Between sobs, she managed to say, "Forgive me for everything. I didn't know how to see. I didn't know how to love." When she could catch her breath, she rang the call bell and asked for the man to come in. Arthur returned with measured steps, leaving Buddy waiting patiently in the hallway. He looked at Kimberly, his gaze steady, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. She asked him, her voice a thread, if that letter had been written in the cottage it spoke of. He replied, "Yes." She wrote it, "Sustained by God and a small lamp." She folded it with trembling hands and asked me to deliver it only when the doctors confirmed your recovery. He added, "Your mother saved me first. She got me out of confinement and a certain death. Then I took her to my farm and watched her be reborn among seeds and sunrises. That is why I am here, fulfilling the last wish of a woman who never stopped being a mother." Kimberly, trembling, said, "I don't deserve this." Arthur replied, "Merit doesn't govern a mother's love. That love isn't negotiated. It's offered, because that is the only way it knows how to exist." He added, "If you want to honor this letter, you must turn this second chance into a different life, a life that heals others, just as your mother healed you with her gift." Then, Kimberly nodded through her tears and said she didn't know how to start, that everything inside her felt like a scorched field. He replied, "You start by picking up the pieces and putting them in the service of someone else. On my farm, there is a simple altar with flowers, where the days smell like earth and bread. One day, when you are able, it would be good for you to see the place where your mother rested in peace during her last nights." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, but reverent. Kimberly looked toward the open door, where Buddy's shadow stood faithfully in the hall. She whispered, "Thank you for taking care of her." Arthur nodded. He never left her side, not even for a moment. Then she looked at the letter again, tracing the lines with her fingertip, as if trying to memorize them. She said, "I will live in a way that these words are not in vain. I will make this life a reparation not to pay a debt. because I know my mother's love kept no accounts but to prevent anyone else from feeling the sting of the abandonment I caused. Arthur bowed his head respectfully and said, "With that decision, the path has already begun. No one can turn back time, but they can reconcile with it." He added, "When one stops looking for absolution in memories and starts looking for it in actions, the nights become less cold." She took a deep breath, looked out the window at the patch of sky she could see, and replied, "If my mother gave me back my life in silence, I will carry her in a quiet voice in every gesture, in every elderly person I embrace, at every table where a plate is missing and I can provide one." As she said this, the tears returned, but now with a different texture, a clean cry that had the shape of a purpose, a cry that made room for peace. Then Arthur, seeing her strength was fading, said he would let her rest, that he would return when she called, and that the cottage and the altar would be there waiting. Before leaving, he added, "Your mother died peacefully." The last word she said was, "Thank you," and she asked that her daughter live without guilt, with joy. When the door closed, Kimberly was left alone with the letter on her chest, the monitor marking a pulse that no longer felt alien. She repeated in a whisper, "You held no grudge. You forgave me, and you want me to be happy." She understood that this command of love was not an indulgence, but a responsibility. The happiness her mother asked of her was a way of honoring her. She squeezed her eyes shut to hold on to the new light that was dawning inside and, still in tears, allowed herself for the first time since childhood to fall asleep with the feeling that someone was holding her from within. Not with reproaches, not with demands, but with the same love that had rescued her from the moral orphanhood she herself had created. Thus, with the letter as a light and sacred weight on her heart, the night enveloped her. And as the hospital continued its rounds and footsteps came and went in the hall, a certainty settled in her chest like a gentle fire. It was too late to ask for forgiveness with her voice, but not to live it with her actions. And that certainty, born of her mother's forgiveness, was the first brick of the new life she had to build. Wayne understood the dimension of his guilt in the discomfort of the silences, in the way the echo of his footsteps resounded in a house that was too orderly and too empty. As Kimberly recovered from the hospital, her expression tired but lit by a new clarity, he knew he didn't fit in that light, that his shadow was in the way. He began to pack clumsily, folding shirts he didn't need and belts that no longer represented authority, while thinking to himself that it was best to leave before his presence contaminated the chance for redemption that was opening up for the woman he had pushed to commit the worst act of her life. When Kimberly found him in front of the closet, staring blankly with the suitcase open, she asked with an unfamiliar serenity, "What are you doing?" He replied, "I'm leaving for a while. I don't know where or for how long. But I've understood that my voice was the rope that tightened a daughter's heart against her mother's chest until it suffocated. And now you need a house clean of my influence to be able to build something different." He added, "I'm not asking for forgiveness, because this isn't the time to demand anything from someone who is learning to breathe again. I'm just asking for the chance to disappear quietly." Kimberly looked at him for a long time and said, "I don't have the strength to hate you, even though I blame you. I want to walk toward a place where my mother's memory doesn't trip over resentment. If leaving is your way of acknowledging the damage, then go in peace." And with that contained farewell, Wayne walked down the stairs with a light suitcase and an enormous burden. He went out to the street, and on the first bus that stopped, he let himself be carried away, aimless, repeating that men learn too late when manhood is not control, but care, and so he was left behind, turned into a rumor of the past that would no longer govern Kimberly's life. With her mother's letter folded in an inside pocket like an amulet and a mirror, Kimberly woke up to a different morning, one that didn't ask for explanations, but for action. After walking several blocks through a neighborhood that suddenly seemed new, she stopped in front of a modest gate with a simple sign that read Senior Day Center. As she crossed it, she felt the weight of shame settle like a stone in her stomach, but she didn't let it paralyze her. She approached the reception and said, "I'd like to volunteer. I don't have formal experience, but I have 2 hands and a story that compels me to serve." The social worker sized her up with a mix of doubt and benevolence until she heard the firmness beneath the voice and replied, "We can start with simple tasks. Helping with snacks, reading aloud, accompanying slow walks in the courtyard. Kimberly accepted without conditions, aware that every gesture was a prayer in motion, rewriting her past. The first days were a school in humility, carrying pitchers of water, fluffing pillows, listening to repeated stories, holding gazes that asked for patience. There were moments when guilt bit her viciously, like when an old woman looked for a son who no longer visited and asked, "Do you think he'll come today?" Kimberly replied, "Maybe tomorrow," while thinking inwardly that this white lie had the bitter taste of her own history. But she didn't run. She stayed and learned to transform every sting into a promise. She would not let another heart crack from her indifference. One of those evenings, as the sun drew strips of light across the patio and the scent of chamomile tea was shared among the tables, she met Beatrice, a woman with braided white hair and wide eyes that seemed to look beyond the walls, sitting alone with a frayed photograph in her fingers. Kimberly approached, offered some tea, and asked what she was remembering. The woman replied, "I remember children who don't come anymore. They have reasons, jobs, excuses. The important thing is not to blame them, so you can sleep. But sometimes the afternoon silence is too heavy in the bones." Just then, Kimberly felt the sting transform into a burning nail. She said, "I understand. I also left a mother alone. But I've learned now that loneliness isn't cured with explanations, but with company." She asked, "May I sit with you?" They began to talk. First of small things, the weather, the flowers in the courtyard, and then of deep things, of losses not named and voids not filled by objects. In that conversation, Kimberly discovered a quiet tenderness in Beatrice, an exhausted but living strength that reminded her of the woman whose handwriting she carried in her pocket. She knew with a certainty that warmed her chest that this old woman would not remain homeless any longer if she could help it. The following week solidified a ritual. Kimberly would arrive early, look for Beatrice, and they would walk very slowly around the planters. Beatrice would say, "The earth breathes better when two people walk on it, and the plants know it." And Kimberly would reply, "If that's true, then this patio must have been very lonely until now, because it was missing the step of someone who wanted to stay." Kimberly would laugh, a shy laugh she had forgotten, and say she was learning to live again, that every cup of tea she served was a brick in her new inner home. Beatrice would squeeze her hand and say, "The houses of the soul creak at first, but then they become strong if they are filled with voices, and I am willing to be one of those voices." One day, after an afternoon of stories and plants, Kimberly worked up the courage and asked the social worker what the requirements were to have a resident come live with her. She explained it wasn't an impulse, that she had thought about it a lot, that her life had been too large for just one person, and that now she needed to share it with someone who understood the weight of waiting. The social worker, who had been observing her consistency and gentleness, said it was possible. There would be papers to sign, basic conditions to check, medical visits to plan, and a network to ensure. Kimberly replied, "I'm ready. My house will open like a bowl to receive water." The day Beatrice crossed the threshold of Kimberly's house with a small suitcase and the frayed photo in her purse, they both felt reality aligning with a silent promise. Kimberly cannot change her past, but she is honoring her mother's sacrifice by changing her future. By opening her home to Beatrice, another soul left behind, she is finally living the lesson of compassion that Clara embodied. This is the true beginning of her redemption. Kimberly said, "This is your home, not out of charity, but out of justice, because no one deserves to end their days watching a door close." And Beatrice replied, "Then I will become the guardian of the windows, so the light always comes in." That simple pact filled the rooms with a sweetness that didn't depend on expensive furniture or new walls, but on the decision not to leave each other alone. Over time, the house adopted new rhythms. Slow breakfasts with warm bread, flower pots lined up on the patio, clothes hung with wooden pins, after-dinner stories where Kimberly confessed pieces of her past without morbidity, and Beatrice responded with wise silences that didn't judge, only accompanied. And so, a life together was woven, one that seemed to obey an ancient choreography where each gesture healed the other a little. One weekend, when the sun was high but gentle, Kimberly suggested visiting the farm to give thanks. She said there was someone who deserved to see with his own eyes what forgiveness had built. They took a dirt road that seemed to lengthen on purpose, to give them time to think. When they arrived, Arthur came out to meet them with a smile that started in his eyes, and Buddy ran ahead like a happy arrow. Kimberly bent down to hug the dog and said, "Thank you for taking care of her." Arthur replied, "I only did what was right. She rescued me twice, once from confinement and once from disbelief." He added, "Seeing you two together is like watching a tree grow that everyone thought was dead." He then led them to the garden, where a small altar of flowers and a quiet candle honored the memory of the woman who had given meaning to it all. Kimberly stood before the image, the letter in her pocket, and murmured, "Mom, look what your love is still doing." She felt a light breeze brush her cheek, like an answer. The epilogue of that story didn't arrive with trumpets, but with the constant murmur of life returning to its course. Kimberly and Beatrice began to care for flowers together, in the city patio and on the farm, trading seeds, learning to transplant without hurting the roots. As they worked, they talked about what it means to repair, about how a broken pot is patiently glued back together, about how a plant is saved if watered in measure. In every metaphor, Kimberly recognized her mother teaching her from within. Arthur watched them from a distance, with a gratitude that needed no words. He would say quietly that the peace he had searched for so long had found a home in these women's hands, which cleaned leaves and watered soil. And Buddy, always alert and gentle, would lie down in the shade with his muzzle on his paws, as if he knew his guard was still necessary, but now to protect a joy that had cost so much. Thus, without theatrics and with the humble dignity of true things, destiny changed its course. Kimberly, transformed, let her life become a workshop of mercy and opened her home to an adoptive mother who had also been abandoned. And in the generous quiet of the farm, under the watch of a man who was rescued and became a rescuer, and under the loving vigilance of a faithful dog, the memory of a 100-year-old woman was held. A woman whose final act of love continued to bloom in every flower those careful hands learned not to let die. We have reached the end of a story about betrayal and great love. Clara's forgiveness not only saved Kimberly's life, but it also saved her soul, bringing about a true redemption. Throughout this journey, which moment truly moved you the most? Was it when the 100-year-old woman was huddled alone under the overpass? Was it when she used a rusty piece of rebar to save Arthur and his dog, Buddy? Or was it the moment she silently decided to go to the hospital, knowing it could be the end for her? I would love to read all of your deep thoughts in the comments below. It is your sharing that builds this meaningful and loving community. Thank you for listening with your whole heart. If this story touched you, please don't hesitate to hit like and share it with those you love. Here, on your screen, is another story that is just as profound. Click on it, and I will see you there. Goodbye, and thank you for always being here.